and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. It was 11:15 on a Thursday morning, and Wolfe was in the plant rooms, murmuring sweet nothings to a particularly temperamental cymbidium. I, being forbidden by all laws of heaven and the master of the house from entering that holy domain without an orchid-related emergency, preferably one involving black rot and divine intervention, was stuck at my desk when the letter arrived. The envelope was creamy, embossed, and smelled faintly of saffron, which is not a common trait among standard correspondence. It bore no return address, but the handwriting was a stylish slant, expensive ink on expensive paper. The mailman who handed it over looked like he'd just been tipped with a bar of gold. I took a moment to admire the wax seal, an actual wax seal, mind you, before breaking it. What can I say? Curiosity is part of the job, even when the client isn't paying yet. Inside was an invitation addressed to Mr. Nero Wolfe, gourmand and gentleman. That, I admit, got a snort out of me. The sender was none other than Martin Belasco, the culinary darling of the Manhattan elite, inviting Wolfe to a private 12-guest tasting at his new experimental kitchen. The kicker? The event would be centered around a single dish. The premiere of Belasco's closely guarded creation, the umbral sauce, served precisely at 8 o'clock that evening. By the time Wolfe stepped into the office, wiping his fingers with surgical delicacy, I was holding the envelope like it contained a live wasp. I read the letter aloud, my voice dripping with sarcasm at every flourish. Wolfe took the seat behind his desk, poured himself a glass of beer from the bottle on the side table, and sipped as if I were narrating a grocery list. He said nothing when I finished, which, in Wolfe speak, is either profound disinterest or slowly blossoming disdain. The silence was broken by Fritz, who appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on his apron. "You said Belasco." His voice was quiet, but there was a slight tremor to it. Not fear, mind you, but the kind that comes when one sees an old wound poked with a new stick. Wolfe nodded. "You know him?" Fritz didn't answer right away. He stepped in, smoothing down his apron as though preparing to confess a crime. 10 years ago, I created a truffle reduction for a seasonal menu at Lemaire's. A month later, Belasco, who had been in the kitchen only once, unveiled his shadow glaze. Same ingredients, same method. "That's a heavy accusation," I said, watching him. "It is no accusation," Fritz replied, and this time his voice was steel, wrapped in lace. "It is memory." Wolfe frowned, tapped his fingers once on the armrest, and muttered, "Piffle." But Fritz, whose passion usually expresses itself through veal stock and lemon zest, stood there unmoving. It was the closest I'd ever seen to him throwing down a gauntlet. Wolfe muttered something unintelligible in German. He was listening now. "You will tell him no," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer again, as if that settled the matter. I raised an eyebrow. "Tell who no?" He waved toward the letter like it was a fly that had interrupted his soup. "This Belasco. I have no interest in tasting sauces stolen or otherwise. It is a publicity stunt, and I do not participate in pageantry for food critics or vainglorious cooks." Fritz stood rooted to the carpet, unusually bold. "Mr. Wolfe, he profited from what was mine. He built a name, perhaps even a fortune, upon what he took without honor." "I am not your champion, Fritz," Wolfe said without looking at him. "I am your employer." "But you are also a gourmand," Fritz replied, not raising his voice but gaining intensity. "Would you not defend the authenticity of your palate if it were challenged? This is no different." There was something about Fritz's quiet fury that got to him. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, and I recognized the shift. Not agreement, not yet, but interest. That rare, dangerous ember that smoldered in his belly when ego, pride, and intellect aligned. I leaned in. "Come on, boss, let me go. I'll taste the sauce. If it's anything like Fritz's, we've got leverage, and if it's not, I get a free meal and probably a column inch or two of insults from Belasco." Wolfe closed his eyes and exhaled as if we'd dragged him into a theological debate on the ethics of frying eggs. "Go," Wolfe said, with all the enthusiasm of a man agreeing to a dental procedure. "But if I must hear a detailed account of Belasco's culinary theatrics, I expect it to be intelligible." "I'll use small words," I offered. He opened one eye. "For once that might help." Fritz, satisfied if not triumphant, inclined his head slightly and returned to the kitchen. I knew we wouldn't get more emotion out of him, but the sparkle behind his retreating back suggested the man might hum while peeling carrots for the next 3 hours. I collected the invitation and checked the address. Uptown, private suite, no press, no critics, just a dozen hand-picked guests and one underpaid private investigator in the mix. I had no doubt I'd be the only one not wearing cufflinks. "You don't trust Belasco," I said, tucking the envelope into my coat. "I do not trust most people, Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe replied. "Belasco merely makes no effort to disguise the reasons why." I moved to the door, pausing for effect. What if I like the sauce? Wolfe didn't look up. "Then I will require you to find gainful employment elsewhere." That was as close to a blessing as I was going to get. As I headed out into the spring sunlight, I couldn't help but feel like something unpleasant was simmering under that umbral sauce, and not just a stolen recipe. Belasco's dining room was less restaurant and more stage set, dim light over fine linen, a hush broken only by the polished clink of silver and the occasional rustle of smug laughter. 12 guests, not including the help, and I was the only one without a title or a column. That suited me fine. They could think I was Wolfe's valet for all I cared, as long as they didn't ask me to carve anything or refill their wine. I was seated to the left of the host, which I assumed was intentional. Belasco, tall and sleek as an oil painting, wore a black Nero jacket and the confidence of a man who thought himself beyond criticism. He greeted me with a smirk and a handshake softer than mousse. "Mr. Wolfe must be saving his appetite," he said. "Pity?" "He eats only what he can control," I said, accepting the menu, which was written in a mixture of French, Latin, and what I assumed was marketing. The guests were a collection of tastefully sharpened personalities. Eleanor Gray, the patroness whose family money had backed more restaurants than I'd eaten at. Alton Varelli, a rival chef with the build of a butcher and the disposition to match. Lenore Vexley, the food critic whose tongue was sharper than her bobbed haircut, and a smattering of editors, investors, and socialites who cared more about what they were seen eating than what it tasted like. No one said it outright, but the tension was layered like a good millefeuille. Everyone here had a stake in the sauce. Some wanted to praise it, others wanted to steal it, and at least one person I sensed had come to bury it. The first 3 courses were showpieces, edible fireworks with names too long and textures too fleeting. I gave them credit for presentation, though Fritz would have muttered something unkind about gratuitous garnish. When the main course arrived, it came with the reverence usually reserved for a final verdict. Porcelain bowls were set before us, each filled with a portion of beef, tenderloin, glazed in a dark, shimmering sauce that caught the candlelight like oil on water. The umbral sauce. Belasco, standing like a priest at the altar, gave a brief sermon on the molecular structure of flavor, the sacred harmony of acid and umami, and some nonsense about tapping into the emotional memory of taste. He might have gone on longer, but Varelli coughed loudly into his napkin and the room chuckled politely. The first spoonful was unexpected, deep, layered, almost melancholy. Fritz might not have designed it that way, but I'd eaten enough of his test batches to know this wasn't a coincidence. The bones of his stolen recipe were here, dressed up in theatrical flair. Around the table, reactions varied. Eleanor Gray smiled too quickly, her eyes fixed on Belasco like a stage mother at opening night. Vexley's brow furrowed, not in disapproval but calculation, her pen poised over a small notepad like a guillotine over a neck. Belasco watched her the way a fox watches a trap it thinks is already sprung. "You like it?" he asked her, too casually. "I haven't decided," she murmured, not looking up. No one noticed that she didn't take another bite. Dessert arrived with all the delicacy of a royal pardon, something chilled, shaped like a flower, and tasting of violet and regret. I was 3 bites in, wondering if I'd need to stop for a burger on the way home, when I heard it. A soft clink. The unmistakable sound of silver meeting porcelain with a different kind of finality. Lenore Vexley had gone oddly still. Her spoon had slipped from her fingers and lay awkwardly on the plate like it had been surprised mid-air. She blinked, once, twice, then slumped gently forward, resting her cheek on the edge of the tablecloth as if overcome by sudden fatigue. It would have been comic if it hadn't turned eerie in a hurry. Eleanor Gray gave a small gasp. Belasco stood frozen, mouth open, holding a wine-glass halfway to his lips. Varelli muttered something in Italian that didn't sound complimentary. No one moved to touch her, not yet. They just watched her tilt sideways, chin now resting on the rim of her dessert bowl, eyelids fluttering. A waiter stepped forward, hesitated, then touched her wrist. He looked up and shook his head. The silence broke in pieces. One guest rose, another backed away from the table. The chef said her name, then louder. It didn't help. Belasco took command like he thought he was still running the kitchen. "Call an ambulance," he snapped. "She must have had something." "She didn't have a second bite," I said aloud. "Whatever got her?" It was in the first. He turned toward me, color draining. "Are you implying—" "I'm implying nothing," I said. "But I am remembering what Mr. Wolfe always says. Death at the dinner table is never convenient." The paramedics came and went, and with them Lenore Vexley, who would not be ordering dessert again. I stayed behind, partly because I had instructions to observe, and partly because I was curious. That's a professional hazard in my line of work. Belasco was pacing like a sous chef behind on risotto. The police hadn't arrived yet, though someone had called them, and the other guests were gathered in clusters, whispering and trading theories. Varelli lit a cigarette and puffed like a steam engine. Eleanor Gray dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin, though I hadn't seen any actual tears. Belasco stopped and turned to face the group. "It wasn't the food," he announced. "That's impossible." "That would be convenient," I said, "but a bit hard to swallow." He ignored me. Everything was controlled, supervised. The plating was done by me personally. The only variable was the wine. "The wine," I repeated. "That bottle you made such a production about opening." He pointed to it. "It was sealed. Tamper-evident foil, custom cork. We opened it at the table. Everyone saw." "Sure," I said, "but only 1 glass went to Vexley. Was that intentional, or just theatrical flair?" His jaw worked. "It's absurd to think anyone tampered with the wine." "I find absurdity and possibility often get along," I said, "especially when someone dies." He looked around at his guests, now watching him with a little less admiration and a little more appraisal. The room was full of suspects and fewer alibis, and I hadn't even asked about the help yet. I made my way toward the kitchen, ignoring Belasco's protest that it was a sacred space. If someone had salted the meal with something other than seasoning, it hadn't happened on the menu. The kitchen was spotless, industrial steel, gleaming counters, and the unmistakable scent of overcompensation. 2 cooks stood at attention, clearly rattled. One of them, a rail-thin man with a nervous blink, confirmed that Belasco had plated the main course himself. The other, built like a linebacker in a hairnet, added that no one had touched the wine except the host. "Where's the porter?" I asked. They exchanged glances. "He left early," the tall one said he wasn't feeling well. "Before or after dessert?" "Before, way before, maybe even before the entree." I thanked them and stepped out. That was enough to activate a certain itch at the base of my spine, the kind that usually meant Saul Panzer would be earning his fee soon. I'd barely made it back to the dining room when the elevator dinged and out stepped Inspector Kramer, wearing the usual look of a man who'd just bitten into something sour and was determined to find out who served it. He didn't even glance at Belasco before locking eyes with me. "Goodwin," he grunted. "Inspector," I replied with a smile. "You're just in time? Dinner's over, but the suspicion's still fresh." "Spare me the garnish," he said. "Tell Wolfe to stay out of it." I shrugged. "You know him, sir. He's not fond of instructions." And with that, the table was set for murder. Wolfe spent most of the next morning in the plant rooms with the Phalaenopsis, feigning indifference to the events of the previous night. I, on the other hand, was engaged in the less botanical pursuit of reading 3 news articles, all of which devoted ink to the tragedy at Belasco's table and a few column inches to the mystery surrounding the source. None mentioned poison, not yet. The papers, like most of Wolfe's clients, preferred euphemism. Fritz had prepared a modest lunch, coddled eggs, smoked trout, and bread that would make a baker weep, and served it with the quiet, sombre air of a man who had seen his culinary bloodline desecrated on a public stage. Wolfe took a sip of beer, set the glass down, and grunted. "It was cyanide." I paused, butter knife mid-spread. "You're sure?" "Certain," he said. "The odour of bitter almonds, faint but present. You noted the glassware?" "I did," I said. "Vexley's was cleared before anyone could sniff it." "Then we must assume the method was post-plating." He reached for the trout, then added, almost reluctantly, "And if the sauce has been altered, as Fritz claims, we have more than murder. We have artistic vandalism." That did it. Fritz, who had been hovering silently near the doorway, spoke up. "It was not an alteration," he said, low and grave. "It was theft, and a defilement." Wolfe nodded. "Then we shall begin. Archie, you will speak with the guests. Saul will inquire about the kitchen porter." "And you?" I asked. He leaned back in his chair. "I will think and preserve Fritz's honour." I started with Alton Varelli, figuring that the man most likely to throw a saucepan at Belasco in public might be equally candid in private. I found him brooding over an espresso in a cafe with far too much chrome. "Goodwin," he grunted, from Wolfe. "You here to ask if I laced the wine?" "That's high on the list," I said, sitting uninvited. "But let's start with this. Did you know what was in that sauce?" Varelli's jaw tightened. "I knew what shouldn't have been. He can't even pronounce morel properly, and suddenly he's inventing reduction techniques that require a decade of intuition. Number, that sauce wasn't his. I've tasted something like it before." "Where?" He hesitated. "Le Maire's, years ago. Belasco staged there, briefly. A month later, his shadow glaze made him a name. I filed that and moved on. Eleanor Gray received me in her penthouse library, flanked by 2 expressionist paintings and a glass of Amontillado that she didn't offer to share. "I suppose you're here to imply I had motive," she said. "Let me save you the trouble. I fund brilliance. I don't destroy it." "Your investment in Belasco's restaurant is substantial? Is that a question?" "Only if your returns depend on critics like Lenore Vexley." She smiled thinly. "Let's say I don't mourn her like the others might." Next came 2 minor guests, a food magazine editor who was visibly spooked and eager to cooperate, and an investment banker who remembered nothing except that the sauce tasted dusky, which may have been a side effect of the Pinot. None of them had alibis, none had fingerprints on a weapon, and none could explain why Vexley alone fell, except perhaps the one person not at the table anymore. And I still didn't know where that porter had gone. Wolfe had only to mutter, "Call Saul," and I was halfway to the phone before he finished the syllables. Saul Panzer isn't just a private operative. He's Wolfe's surgical instrument when delicacy and absolute discretion are required. If I'm a blunt object with charm, Saul is the stiletto in the silk sheath. I briefed him quickly that evening in Wolfe's office. He listened without nodding, interrupting, or flinching. When I finished, he simply asked, "You want the wine angle or the kitchen porter?" "Both," Wolfe said from behind his desk, "but the porter first. The man is missing, and missing men often precede meaningful answers." "I'll start with the restaurant staff," Saul said, rising. "There's always someone who's been paid late or tipped poorly. They talk." And the wine? Wolfe asked. Saul smiled faintly. I know someone at the distributor. I'll find out who handled the shipment, and whether that bottle Belasco opened was as pristine as he claimed. He was out the door 5 minutes later. I turned to Wolfe, who was sipping a second bottle of the Alsatian white Fritz had unearthed for lunch. You think the wine was the method? I think, Wolfe said, that a wine bottle, properly resealed, can carry more than a bouquet. I admit that didn't sit well. I've had wine faked on me before, but never in such lethal proportions. Suppose the poison wasn't in the sauce at all, I said, just in her glass. Suppose so, Wolfe replied. But then we must ask, who poured? It was a fair question. And the more I thought about it, the fewer people had an answer. Saul returned 40 hours later, without fanfare, with information that would have taken most men a week and a subpoena. He eased into Wolfe's office, dusted his shoes with a handkerchief, and got straight to it. The porter's name is Felix Marin, he said. 24, ex-con, did 6 months for grand theft, boosted a delivery van in Hell's Kitchen, kept his nose clean since, at least on paper. Where is he? Wolfe asked. Vanished, walked out of Belasco's kitchen 2 hours before dessert, told a line cook he felt sick, never came back. No one's heard from him. But I got a lead from a dishwasher who says Maron was shaking like a leaf when he left, white as a tablecloth. Wolfe made a sound halfway between interest and digestion. And the wine? Saul nodded. The bottle came from Duval Imports. I spoke with a handler who loaded that exact case. The seal looked intact, but here's the twist. The cork had been professionally reinserted, not amateur stuff, done with a twin-blade cork puller and a heat gun. Whoever did it knew the tools. That was a detail worth more than its weight in grapes. So, I said, someone removed the cork, introduced something nasty, and reinserted it so cleanly it passed for untouched? Exactly. And only Vexley got a pour from that bottle? That's the part I'm checking, Saul said. But my contact remembers there was only one bottle of that vintage in the entire shipment. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, lips pressed together. If the sauce wasn't the murder weapon, the wine had just taken center stage, and someone had played sommelier with a scalpel. By mid-afternoon, the brownstone had returned to its preferred climate of controlled calm, no guests, no calls, and only the muffled symphony of Fritz orchestrating lunch in the kitchen. I had just finished writing up Saul's report on the resealed wine bottle when Fritz stepped in, apron dusted with flour, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. I have confirmed it, he said, without preamble. Wolfe looked up from his book, one eyebrow slightly raised. Confirmed what? The truffle in Belasco's sauce, Fritz replied. It was tuber melanosporum. Black winter truffle, yes, but specifically a strain harvested in late January from Perigord soil. Highly aromatic, rich, but that alone is not the issue. Continue, Wolfe said, setting down his book. Fritz folded his arms. The specific strain he used is known to contain a natural compound, androstenol. In large quantities, it can affect taste perception. In some, it causes euphoria. In others, nausea. And if combined with certain compounds, particularly tannins or sulfites, it can cause an unpredictable metabolic response. I whistled low. Are you saying the sauce itself could have made someone sick? Fritz shook his head. Not fatally, but it would have masked subtle signs of something that would. And its presence means the sauce was deliberately manipulated, not merely replicated. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. So not merely theft of recipe, but corruption of design. Yes, Fritz said, and a deliberate one. Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. Archie, find out what Vexley intended to say about Belasco. She may have written more than tasting notes. I was already reaching for my hat. Vexley's editor, one Peter Lott, kept an office lined with framed front pages and the bruised air of a man who lived between deadlines. He wore tortoise-shell glasses and the expression of someone who hadn't slept well since Prohibition ended. She wasn't liked, he told me flatly, after verifying I wasn't press. but she was respected. Lenore didn't review restaurants, she exposed them. I nodded. Wolfe thinks she might have written something serious, about Belasco. He hesitated, then turned to a slim drawer in his desk. From it, he withdrew a manila folder. She filed this 3 days ago. It was slated for Monday's issue. I was going to bury it after the incident at the dinner out of respect, but, well, read it. The title alone was enough to lift my eyebrows. The source that wasn't his. The column didn't mince words, it named Belasco. It cited his stint at Le Maire's, hinted at similarities to a lesser-known house source used during that same season, and concluded, with an edge Vexley honed well, that Belasco's brilliance was built on someone else's foundation. She had proof? I asked. She claimed to, Lott replied, but she was saving it for the follow-up. Said the source had a molecular footprint she could trace. Did anyone know about this column in advance? Only me, and maybe Belasco if he caught wind of it. He wasn't fond of her. Said she was ruining the romance of cuisine. I stood, folding the piece carefully. Romance aside, someone made sure it was her last review. And if Belasco hadn't read it yet, someone else had. Saul returned the next morning with the same unhurried gait he always carried after uncovering something foul. He removed his hat, dusted it once with the side of his coat, and sat across from Wolfe, who was nursing a glass of buttermilk and pretending it was acceptable. I checked the delivery logs, Saul said. There was a courier drop-off at Belasco's kitchen the afternoon of the dinner, marked as private culinary sample. No company name, no invoice. The manager assumed it was a spice shipment. Belasco gets exotic imports all the time. And the contents? Wolfe asked. Saul pulled a small notebook from his pocket. A single vial, amber glass, unlabeled. Kitchen assistant remembered it because the bottle wasn't opened in the prep area. It went straight to Belasco's personal shelf. Wolfe's brow twitched. Describe the assistant. Ecuadorian, speaks decent English, no reason to lie. He remembered it because Belasco shouted at him for touching it. I leaned forward. So Belasco received a mystery vial, handled it himself, and then someone ends up dead over dinner. You think that's coincidence? Saul looked at Wolfe. You want me to find the courier? Yes, Wolfe said. Find who dispatched the parcel, and who paid for it. I'll need a day, Saul said. Take 2, Wolfe replied. When Saul left, Wolfe remained silent, steepling his fingers in front of his face like a judge contemplating a sentence. I knew that look. He wasn't just considering ingredients or motives, he was weighing intent. A vial with no sender, a critic with no breath, and a recipe with no creator. Something was starting to curdle. That afternoon, I made my way back to Belasco's kitchen, not through the front, where journalists had started sniffing around, but via the alley that led to the staff entrance. I wasn't looking for plates, I was looking for paper. The line cook, who had first tipped Saul off about the porter, name was Diego, was on break, leaning against the dumpster and nursing a cigarette like it held answers. I'm not here to get you fired, I said. Just tell me if anyone's been writing Belasco things he didn't want to read. Diego hesitated, then shrugged. He kept getting these little envelopes, no return address, always with the morning produce. First few he tore up in front of everyone, then he started pocketing them. How many? 3 or 4. You ever read one? One time, yeah. Snuck a peek before he noticed. Just a few lines. You built your kingdom on stolen flavor, the taste of betrayal will cost you dearly. Something like that. Poetic, I said. Any idea who sent them? No, but it rattled him. I saw him argue with Eleanor Gray the day the third one arrived. Quiet, but sharp, like they'd had this fight before. That was enough to whet the edge of Wolfe's knife. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe a transcript of the note. He read it, expression flat, and said, "There are crimes of opportunity, Mr. Goodwin, and then there are those born of long simmering." I nodded. You think this one's been on the stove for years? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. When Wolfe retreated to the plant rooms mid-morning, it was not out of habit, it was calculation. I've seen the man enter that green jungle with the calm of a bishop before Mass, and I've also seen him storm in there to hide from an irate client or an uncomfortable reality, but this time it was different. He wasn't brooding, he was fermenting. I took that as a signal to stay out of his line of fire, so I remained in the office, filing notes, rereading Saul's report, and sorting through my own observations. The threads were beginning to knot themselves. We had a dead critic, a tainted wine bottle, an altered recipe with hallucinogenic truffle overtones, anonymous threats, a missing porter, and a mystery vial that stank of bespoke malice. And behind it all, Martin Belasco, too vain to be careful, too confident to lie well. Wolfe emerged from the plant rooms just before lunch, his expression unreadable but taut. He went straight to his desk, sat down heavily, and poured himself a glass of beer from the bottle Fritz had left ready. He didn't speak. I waited. He finally said, "There are three forces at play: ambition, fear, and resentment. They have intersected in one act." "You think it was deliberate?" I said. "Certainly. Accidental murder is as rare as accidental soufflé." "And Vexley?" He frowned. She had become inconvenient, not because she knew too much, but because she was about to prove it. He picked up a pen, tapped it once against the blotter, and muttered, "Miss Grey is due for a visit?" So I grabbed my coat. Eleanor Grey lived in a Fifth Avenue penthouse with enough marble to make a Roman senator blush. Her doorman took one look at my card and rang up without asking whether I had a warrant or a reason. Evidently, the name Nero Wolfe still worked its old magic, even among the upper crust. She greeted me in a silk wrap the colour of old champagne and offered tea, which I declined. Her voice had the glide of money and the chill of practiced control. "Detective Goodwin," she said, folding herself onto a sofa worth more than my yearly wardrobe. "To what do I owe this unannounced incursion?" "Just a friendly chat," I said, "though you might find the topic less cordial." Her smile didn't crack. "Belasco? And Vexley? And possibly a missing kitchen porter, if we're casting a wide enough net." "I'm not in the habit of fraternizing with kitchen staff." "Fair enough. But you did fund Belasco's restaurant, didn't you? And before that you had a brief financial entanglement with Alton Varelli?" That hit a nerve. Her lashes fluttered once, tiny but noticeable. "I invest in talent, Mr. Goodwin. Sometimes that requires repositioning." "Is that what you call it?" "I supported Varelli before I realized he lacked the charisma necessary to sustain a public persona. Martin was more palatable, even if his recipes were borrowed goods." Her eyes sharpened. "You're parroting Lenore's theories. She had a vendetta. She believed culinary success was a matter of attribution, not execution. She believed in truth, and it may have killed her." There was a long pause. Then she rose, walked to a sideboard, and poured herself a drink she didn't touch. "For the record," she said, "I had no idea what Lenore planned to publish. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks." "Really?" I pulled out a small printout. "Phone records say otherwise. 3 calls between you and her in the week before the dinner." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her tone was cooler. "She wanted me to pull my funding, said Martin was a fraud. I told her I'd consider it. And then she died." Her eyes met mine, level. "Are you accusing me?" "Not yet," I said, standing. "But someone's recipe's about to go up in flames." And I didn't think it would be the truffle reduction. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Fritz was pacing the kitchen like a general planning an assault. Not that he ever raised his voice or threw utensils. No, when Fritz was angry, the butter was whipped harder, the stock simmered darker, and the knives gleamed with a kind of vengeful clarity. "I need to show you," he said, and gestured for me to follow. On the counter sat 2 bowls of sauce, nearly identical in appearance, both thick, dark, glossy, and menacing as black ink. "This," he said, pointing to the left, "is my version. The original." From the Le Maire Kitchen Journal. I recreated it to the last gram and the other. The one you described from Belasco's table. I dipped a spoon in each and tasted. Fritz watched me like a professor grading a final exam. They're close, I said, but not twins. Yours is deeper, earthier. The other had something floral, faint but odd. He nodded once. Belasco altered the acid ratio, added hibiscus extract and adjusted the emulsification technique to mask the truffle's secondary notes. But the bones of it, the marrow, are mine. I relayed Wolfe's suspicion that the sauce had been corrupted deliberately. Fritz didn't flinch. It's worse than theft, he said. It's desecration. He took something crafted with precision and turned it into performance, flavor without foundation, and now someone is dead. He removed his apron, folded it, and looked at me. Whoever did this didn't just poison a plate, he said. They poisoned truth. You tell Mr. Wolfe I'm ready to testify. He meant it. And in that moment I realized the motive wasn't just professional. It was personal. Wolfe took the news of the sauce's genetic makeup with a nod so small it might have been mistaken for a muscle twitch. He sipped his beer, glanced toward the empty red chair where clients usually perched, and said, It's consistent. With murder? I asked. With betrayal, he replied. The sauce was the stage, but the act was committed off it. He leaned back, fingertips pressed together. If the poison had been cooked in, the heat would have altered its chemical structure, cyanide especially, and yet its presence remained potent and fatal. So it wasn't in the pot. No, he said. It was added later, after the food had left the pan, after plating, perhaps even after serving. After serving? I echoed. You mean someone tampered with her dish at the table? Or just before it reached her, Wolfe said. We must ask ourselves, who had proximity and opportunity? I began to mentally scan the guest list. A waiter, perhaps? A meddlesome diner? But Wolfe was already ahead of me. Miss Vexley was not served wine by a waiter, he said. She was poured by Belasco himself, in a gesture of theatrical control. And the food? Plated personally, yes, but if the dish was briefly intercepted, he trailed off, and his gaze shifted toward the orchid room. That meant one of two things. Either the case had ripened past conjecture, or the answer was beginning to bloom. I didn't press, not yet, but I was beginning to see it, how someone could take a truth so delicate and turn it into a lie with just one sleight of hand. Wolfe doesn't extend invitations. He issues summonses, curt, precise, and dressed in the language of obligation. When the 12 people who had circled Belasco's table that fatal night each received an envelope bearing the letterhead of Nero Wolfe and a terse request to attend a culinary reconstruction at the brownstone, none declined. Curiosity may not kill, but it certainly motivates. The pretense was simple. Wolfe, in the interest of professional clarity and with due courtesy to all involved, intended to recreate the dinner that had ended so poorly. The purpose, stated as delicately as a lace doily, was to better understand the sequence of events leading to Miss Vexley's untimely demise. The actual purpose, naturally, was to provoke. You expect someone to confess between courses? I asked him, watching as he dictated the final phrasing. No, he said, sealing the envelope. I expect someone to contradict themselves. It was a full-day production. Saul handled discreet calls to ensure attendance. I coordinated with the guests, made notes on seating arrangements, allergies, eccentric preferences, and anything else that might make them squirm. Belasco was the only one who showed reluctance, but Wolfe's note had included a promise to allow him to defend the integrity of his creation. That scratched just enough of his ego to get a yes. Even Kramer received an invitation, not to attend, but to be on standby. Wolfe didn't need a show of force, he just needed the right person nearby when the curtain fell. Wolfe, of course, would remain seated throughout like a king holding court, while I danced around playing maitre d', detective, and stagehand. Everyone would be served the exact same thing, same sauce, same wine, same everything, except this time Wolfe would be the one controlling every detail. And if someone twitched at the wrong moment, blinked at the wrong plate, or hesitated before raising their glass, well, I'd be watching. Fritz approached the task with the solemnity of a surgeon preparing for a commemorative dissection. He reviewed his notes from the Lemaire kitchen, consulted his original proportions, adjusted for plating intervals, and demanded the precise vintage of wine Belasco had used. Not merely the label, he told me, but the bottling run. There is subtlety even in the same vine. He turned the kitchen into a sanctum of sacred ratios. Fritz may be gentle in manner, but when his honor as a chef is called into question, he becomes a quiet storm. I stayed out of his way except to confirm that the dining room had been set exactly as it had been in Belasco's suite. Same seating pattern, same flower arrangements, even the same ambient temperature. Wolfe insisted on it. "Atmosphere affects behavior," he said. "We want not memory, we want reaction." Saul handled surveillance. He installed 2 discrete microphones, one in the dining room, one in the front vestibule, and stationed himself upstairs with a view through the transom. Not to spy exactly, but to observe nuance, who glanced where, who clutched their fork too tightly, who poured their wine too slowly. As for me, I'd be circulating, topping off glasses, offering napkins, and delivering polite deflections to impolite questions. By the time the doorbell rang and Eleanor Gray entered, followed by Varelli, Belasco, and the rest of the culinary court, the air was already spiced, not with truffle or rosemary, but something more pungent: expectation. And Fritz, from behind the kitchen door, called out softly, "Service in 3 minutes." Wolfe, seated in his chair like a man awaiting a storm, merely lifted his eyes to the dining room and said, "Let them taste what truth requires." They came one by one, not quite like mourners, but close, each guest ushered into Wolfe's dining room with the wariness of someone attending a séance led by the ghost. Eleanor Gray arrived first, sharp as ever in a sable wrap and ice-cold smile, trailed by Alton Varelli, whose tie looked like it had lost an argument with a meat grinder. Belasco, ever the peacock, followed with his usual affectation of ease and a pair of gloves he didn't take off, as if he expected to handle raw garlic mid-meal. The others trickled in, the food editor with eyes darting like he owed someone something, the financier who had been too drunk to remember anything last time, and the waiter from the original evening who now resembled a man caught in a hurricane with a napkin. They were seated per Wolfe's specific order. I had the chart memorized and the place cards perfectly aligned. No one protested. Perhaps they thought Wolfe would ask them to taste arsenic if they objected. Wolfe, of course, did not dine. He presided. He remained in his chair, back in the shadows of the room where he could see everyone and everything, his hands steepled beneath his chin like he was communing with his own thoughts. He didn't speak. Not yet. But his silence worked the way a master's brush does, shaping the air with invisible strokes. The food was served. Fritz's replica of the umbral sauce came out in perfect intervals. Wine poured in matching glasses. Forks clinked. Conversation tried to restart, but stumbled over self-consciousness. Eleanor commented on the floral note. Varelli muttered something about authenticity. Belasco, for his part, barely touched his plate. I hovered in the corner, watching their eyes more than their mouths. People reveal more in silence. They glanced, measured, counted bites, recounted glances. Each face wore the mask of memory, stretched over nerves that twitched under pressure. Wolfe remained motionless. He knew, as did I, that this wasn't a dinner, it was a performance, and someone was forgetting their lines. Halfway through the second course, I began noticing something that hadn't struck me before. It wasn't the arrangement of guests or the flavor of the dish, it was the glassware. Fritz, being the perfectionist he is, had insisted we replicate everything down to the stem pattern. I'd helped unpack the original 12 from the same set used at Belasco's soirée. I'd checked them myself, and yet one glass was missing, specifically Eleanor Gray's. Her wine had been poured into a similar but distinctly different glass, one with a slightly thicker stem and a wider bowl. It was a minor difference, subtle enough to escape anyone else's notice. but I'd packed them, and I knew. Wolfe would too, of course. So I waited until I was back in the kitchen to ask Fritz. He frowned, wiped his hands, and went to check the rack. "No," he said at last. "That is not the glass she used that night. I remember she made a comment about the balance, that it felt French in the hand. This one? This is from a different set." I brought the information back to Wolfe, low and quiet. He didn't respond. Just closed his eyes for a full 3 seconds. "Archie," he murmured, "where do glasses go when they are not returned to the rack?" "Wherever someone doesn't want them found," I said. He nodded. "And who touched that glass before it vanished?" "Only Eleanor. She poured her own wine, same as she did the night Vexley died." "Exactly." The way he said it chilled me more than the logic of the conclusion. In a room where everyone was trying to hide their motives, someone had hidden a glass. And now Wolfe had them all drinking from the same one. When Saul Panzer tracks someone, they stay found, even if they don't want to be, especially if they don't want to be. Felix Mauren, former kitchen porter at Belasco's Palace of Pretension, had done a reasonable job of making himself scarce. A borrowed couch in the Bronx, no phone, no employer, and a tendency to disappear behind the nearest stairwell anytime someone asked too many questions. Unfortunately for him, Saul's idea of too many begins with one. I got the full report over coffee in Wolfe's office, while Saul polished his glasses with a handkerchief and delivered the facts in a voice as dry as a rye cracker. "He saw her," Saul said, "Eleanor Gray, in the kitchen, after plating had begun but before the main course left for the table. He was walking in with clean silverware and caught her leaning over one of the dishes." "Vexley's," I guessed. "Right." "Did he say what she was doing?" "He didn't know. Said she slipped something from her purse, small vial, touched the plate, maybe the wine, maybe both. She looked up, saw him watching, and followed him out." "Followed him?" "She cornered him by the rear door, told him to keep quiet. Said if he mentioned her, she'd make sure his parole officer got an anonymous tip that he'd been drinking on the job." Wolfe's lips pursed. "And he believed her?" "Of course," Saul said. "She had the kind of voice people believe." But once Vexley died and the police got involved, Felix panicked. He assumed he'd be blamed, so he bolted. I looked at Wolfe. "That's motive, method, and opportunity." He nodded slowly. "It is also fear, a useful ingredient." Saul tucked his glasses away. "I have Felix in a safe location. He'll testify." Wolfe didn't respond right away. He rose, walked to the window, and looked out, though what he ever saw there, I couldn't guess. "Mr. Panzer," he said, "Miss Gray tampered with the plate not because she hated Vexley personally, but because Vexley threatened to dismantle the illusion Miss Gray had built around Belasco." "An illusion she bankrolled," I added. Wolfe turned. "And now, with our next course, the illusion will begin to collapse." He wasn't smiling. And when Wolfe doesn't smile, someone's about to be very uncomfortable. After the guests had excused themselves from the dining table, most of them without finishing their food, I joined Fritz in the kitchen. He was rinsing the plates with surgical care, but I knew that wasn't about cleanliness. It was evidence control. "Did you isolate hers?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Yes, I marked it with a thread of saffron before I brought it out." "Can you tell if anything was added?" He opened a drawer and removed a small stoppered vial, holding it between 2 fingers as if it were a spider he didn't intend to kill, but wanted nowhere near his countertop. "There is a scent," he said, uncorking it and holding it to my nose. It was faint, but unmistakable. Bitter almonds, death's perfume. "Cyanide," I said. He nodded. "Minimal, barely detectable, but potent." Wolfe had emerged by then, looming in the doorway like judgment in a chair. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Fritz met his eyes. "It was not in the sauce. It was added after, and only to 1 plate." Wolfe inhaled deeply, as if tasting the truth through the air. Then he turned and walked silently back to his office. I followed, of course, and found him already seated, fingers steepled, eyes closed. His mind, I knew, was turning like a key in an ancient lock. He spoke without opening his eyes. She feared exposure. She did not wish to silence Vexley's opinion, only to delay its publication, perhaps enough to discredit it, perhaps enough to kill it softly. Softly didn't work, I said. No, Wolfe agreed. So she used the simplest method, the most cowardly. Cyanide in a controlled environment. Precisely. I poured myself a drink I hadn't earned and watched him sit with it, this case that had fermented from insult to vendetta to something colder. He didn't gloat, he didn't sigh, he simply said, "Call Mr. Kramer." Then he closed his eyes again as if his work here was done, but the confrontation I knew was still to come. When Wolfe summons suspects, he does not issue invitations. He announces a time and place, and you attend, if not out of respect, then out of fear that the truth will unfold in your absence. By 6 o'clock that evening, the same familiar faces once again took their places in Wolfe's office, each wearing a different kind of discomfort. Eleanor Gray arrived with her usual serenity, though a flicker at the corner of her mouth betrayed strain. Belasco sat stiffly, tapping a nervous rhythm on the arm of his chair. Varelli crossed his arms and glared at the carpet, as if he were planning to remodel it with a knife. The others, the waiter, the editor, even the banker with the digestive issues, watched Wolfe like parishioners awaiting a sermon with fire and brimstone. Wolfe remained seated behind his desk, resplendent in his favorite canary yellow vest. He didn't rise, he didn't raise his voice. He merely gestured for the door to be closed and folded his hands over his considerable midsection. "I have no desire to detain you unnecessarily," he began. "I abhor prolonged conversation without purpose. Therefore I shall make my intentions clear." He scanned the room. "You are here because someone among you murdered Lenore Vexley. The method was cyanide. The setting was theatrical. The motive, is far more refined than mere hatred or fear." Belasco stirred in protest, but Wolfe silenced him with a glance that could wither parsley. "I have no intention of persuading you to confess. That will not be required. I am not the law, merely its friend, but I shall present what I know, and if it compels Mr. Kramer to act, so be it." That was when the room got very still, because when Wolfe stops circling, someone is always at the center. "You must understand," Wolfe said, voice cool and deliberate, "that the source was never the crime, it was the currency." He turned toward Belasco, who squirmed like a soufflé collapsing under heat. "You took a recipe," Wolfe said, "a creation that belonged to Fritz Brenner, and you altered it. You presented it as your own, draped it in affectation, and sold it to the highest bidder. That bidder was Miss Eleanor Gray." He shifted his gaze. "You, madam, recognized the genius in the original but saw its author as commercially inconvenient. So you redirected your patronage to Mr. Belasco, repackaged talent in a more marketable shell, and as long as the illusion held, you profited, financially, socially, even personally." Eleanor's lips parted, but Wolfe held up a finger. Miss Vexley, however, had no interest in illusion. She was prepared to publish an exposé, a column that would not only discredit Mr. Belasco, but also reveal your complicity. You did not need to hate her to silence her, only to need her gone. There was a pause, brief, but weighted. You arranged the moment. You tampered with her plate while pretending to inspect the wine. You carried the vial yourself, and when the critic fell, you mourned, publicly, tastefully, but quietly retrieved the only evidence that could link the crime to your fingers, your wineglass, the only one never returned to the rack. Eleanor's face was pale. Belasco stared at her as if he'd been slapped. "You killed not from rage," Wolfe said, "but from investment." He leaned back. "And that, madam, makes it all the more contemptible." No one spoke. Because the truth, once plated, required no garnish. Wolfe's gaze moved with all the force of a guillotine falling, unhurried, inevitable, and merciless. It came to rest once more on Eleanor Gray, who still sat with the poise of a portrait, though one now beginning to crack beneath the varnish. You are not, Miss Grey, an impulsive woman. That would be beneath you. You do not shout and you do not stab, but you do plan, and you did." He placed his fingertips together. "You requested a specific seat at the dinner. You insisted, gently, of course, that Miss Vexley be placed to your right. That detail was confirmed by the event coordinator, who said you phrased it as aesthetic balance." A dry cough from Varelli was stifled before it became a laugh. Wolfe continued, unperturbed. "During the wine presentation, as Mr. Belasco uncorked the bottle with his customary dramatics, there was a moment, 15 seconds, perhaps less, when you leaned across Vexley's setting to admire the vintage, a gesture of refinement." He paused. "That was the moment. The fork was already on the plate, the wineglass within reach. You did not need time, only opportunity, and you had prepared." Eleanor didn't speak, but the knuckles of her right hand whitened against the armrest of the chair. Wolfe turned slightly. Miss Vexley took one bite and sipped once. The rest you know. What you did not know, what you could not know, was that Fritz, in his quiet thoroughness, had marked the base of her plate, a thread of saffron placed beneath, invisible unless searched for. He opened his eyes fully. That marked plate came back with a faint residue, a trace that told us the poison was added not in preparation, but in plating, not in heat, but in cold intention. No one moved, not even Belasco. A murder committed not with passion, but with polish, and so the blade you used was not steel, but social elegance. He sat back and waited, because Wolfe never raises his voice when the truth can do it for him. I'd been holding the ace, waiting for the moment Wolfe signalled, not with a word, but with a subtle tilt of his chin. I stood and crossed to the sideboard, where a small lacquered box rested, inconspicuous to anyone who didn't know Wolfe kept nothing ornamental unless it had purpose. I opened it and removed the pair of pale suede gloves we'd retrieved that morning, left tucked in the lining of a coat Eleanor had worn to the first dinner. I held them up. "Yours, I believe." Eleanor's mouth parted, not in surprise, but in preparation, either to deny or dismiss. But before she could choose, I continued. "These were tested by our chemist, an associate of Saul's who knows how to be discreet. Both gloves bore trace elements of sodium cyanide, minute but measurable. More interestingly, one was lightly stained with a vintage red identical to the bottle Belasco poured that night." I crossed to her, set them on the edge of Wolfe's desk, and stepped back. "It would appear," Wolfe said mildly, "that the only thing you failed to discard was the truth." Eleanor stared at the gloves. Her fingers twitched once, just enough to betray thought. Fight or flee, neither viable. Finally, she exhaled. "I didn't mean to kill her," she said, almost too softly. "I meant only to silence her, delay the column, ruin her taste, perhaps. I didn't—" "You meant to preserve an investment," Wolfe interrupted, "and you gambled with a woman's life." She turned to Belasco, whose face was now an unreadable mask. "I did it for you," she said, voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Outside the office door, a knock came. Kramer, punctual as always. Inside, Wolfe said nothing more, because when a lie finally confesses itself, silence is the most elegant reply. There's a particular silence that comes after a confession, not loud, not triumphant, but still enough to squeeze the air from the room. Eleanor Grey didn't weep, didn't faint, didn't even blink. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap, like a woman waiting for the check at a dinner party that had soured halfway through the salad course. Wolfe regarded her not with triumph, but with something closer to disdain, though still restrained, mind you. He never indulged in moral preening. His satisfaction came solely from the arrangement of facts into irrefutable truth, and this one had been plated to perfection. "I presume," he said, turning slightly toward me, "that Mr. Kramer has not strayed." "He's on deck," I said, and crossed to the office door. I opened it just enough to nod, Inspector Kramer entered with the careful tread of a man used to walking into rooms heavy with guilt and expectation. He didn't need me to say a word. One glance at Eleanor, then at the gloves on the desk, was enough to get him halfway to the conclusion. Wolfe filled in the rest in 7 sentences, most of them shorter than Eleanor's necklace. Kramer waited until Wolfe finished, then turned to her. "Miss Gray, you'll need to come with me, quietly." She stood, composed as always. "Naturally, Inspector. I only ask that you allow me a moment to gather my coat." Kramer nodded, and I retrieved it from the rack. She took it from me without meeting my eyes. Not out of shame, I don't think. Eleanor Gray didn't believe in shame, not as a social function at least. To her, guilt was a matter of convenience. She turned once before exiting, to Belasco. "I protected you," she said. He said nothing. And then she left. Kramer gave Wolfe a nod, half salute, half admission of gratitude, and followed her out. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "Archie?" "Yes, sir?" "Beer." I poured. He drank. Then he closed his eyes. Outside, a siren began to fade in the distance. Inside, the scent of orchids reclaimed the room. And whatever was left of Eleanor Gray's reputation had been served, without heat, without rage, but thoroughly and irrevocably cold. There are meals at the brownstone that Fritz prepares because he must. Sustenance for Wolfe, comfort for me, duty in service of civility. And then there are meals like the one he made that evening, meals prepared as vindication, as revenge on falsehood, as resurrection of truth from a stolen kitchen. Fritz emerged from his sanctum bearing a copper saucepan with the reverence of a priest presenting relics. He ladled the sauce onto Wolfe's plate, lamb, roasted to medium rare, rested beside hand-milled potatoes and thin coins of carrot. The sauce, deep and glistening, ran like silk and stopped, just short of theatrical. Wolfe inhaled before lifting his fork. He cut slowly, precisely, and tasted. There was no exclamation, no raised eyebrow, just a long, contemplative silence. Then the rarest of occurrences, he spoke before swallowing. "Excellent." Fritz didn't beam. He simply nodded and returned to the kitchen. I followed soon after to retrieve my own plate, slightly smaller portion, but equal in flavour. Fritz set it down with the air of a man who had just unburdened himself. "It is mine again," he said, "clean, as it was meant to be." We ate in silence. Wolfe, still seated at the dining table, instead of retreating to the office, occasionally dabbed his lips but otherwise made no comment, his concentration entirely devoted to the nuances of taste, texture, temperature. As for me, I wasn't sentimental, but even I could admit the sauce was a little like justice, best when served exact, uncompromised, and after one's palate had been primed to appreciate it. Wolfe, as if echoing the thought, lifted his glass and murmured, "At last, something true." After the plates were cleared and Fritz had retreated to his post-prandial ritual, a single espresso and a 3-minute stare into the pantry, I found myself swirling the last of my wine and feeling rather pleased with the world. Not smug, just satisfied. The difference, Wolfe would say, being one of tone and waistline. "You know," I said, "we really ought to trademark that sauce." Wolfe, seated once more in his office chair and resting his bulk like a sated lion, said nothing, not even a grunt. "Think about it," I went on. "Call it Fritz's Redemption. Sell it by the jar. A label with your face, pursed lips, arched eyebrow. You'd outsell ketchup in a month." Still nothing. "Fine," I said, "but when someone else steals it again, don't blame me." He reached for his beer and sipped, unhurried. Then, very softly, he muttered, "Pfui." It wasn't quite approval, but it wasn't dismissal either, which, in Wolfe's language, counted as a standing ovation. The phone rang just as I was folding the last of the linen napkins. One ring, sharp and persistent. Wolfe looked up, frowned at the receiver, and, breaking tradition, made no move to answer or even instruct me to do so. He simply closed his eyes and exhaled with the gravity of a man who'd already had enough human interaction for 1 week. I picked it up. Nero Wolfe's residence, Goodwin speaking. A voice on the other end began unravelling a story about a missing heirloom, a suspicious brother-in-law, and an unfortunate string of accidents involving indoor begonias. I held the receiver to my chest. "It's a live one," I said. "Do we bite?" Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "Not tonight." "Tomorrow?" He reached for his beer, took a slow sip, and muttered, "Possibly." I relayed the message, told the woman we'd call her back, and hung up. Outside, Manhattan buzzed its usual tune: cars, arguments, a saxophone played badly. Inside, the brownstone was still, save for the clink of glass and the distant hum of orchids breathing in their steamy sanctuary. Justice had been served, the source was safe, and Wolfe, at least for now, was full.